So first up, we have Mini Bhati. Did I say your last name correctly?
Close enough.
Okay, close enough. So you are an engineer at Cisco and based in India. So I'll go ahead and let you take over. So you specialize in UX and UI, and you really enjoy making like performant and really engaging front-end applications. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Well, I'll let you get started, and then I'll have some more questions for you at the end.
Sure.
So if all of our panelists could go ahead and turn off their video while Mini presents, and then we'll come back on at the end.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mini Bhatti, and I'm going to talk about dependency injection today. So how many of you have come across this error? Post in the chat, raise your hands. Yes, quite a few. So let's first understand what the error says. It says no provider for dummy service, which means Angular is not able to identify or find our dummy service. And here is the service, which looks perfectly fine to me, but still there's something missing, which why we get that error. Here, the magic word provided in root. Uh, does anybody know what does this do, or any idea or guesses? Yep, singleton, true. Yes. So this is basically telling Angular that this service is available at the root and you can use it across the application. Basically, dependency injection starts. So let's first understand what dependency injection is. It is a design pattern in which a class requests dependencies from external resources rather than creating themselves. So what does this mean, basically? Let's try to understand this from an analogy. Just imagine this as a user component, and I'm giving you a scenario to paint and in your head, and which is you in this post-pandemic offices are opening, so we're going back to work. So imagine a scenario where you have to go to work, and then what are the things which you absolutely need? If you have anything in your mind, anything. For me, yes, shoes, desk. Yes. So for me, clothes. Obviously, you need work clothes to go to the office, and car. You need something to travel to the office. Now you're dependent on these two things. Today you drive some car. Tomorrow, if I upgrade to a Ferrari to go to the office, all I need are the keys. So this is in a way I'm dependent on these things. This is dependency. I'm creating dependency on these two things. Let's place that user and put it in the component. This is a user component, and in the constructor, we are injecting two services: car services, clothes services. Car service is basically responsible for giving you all the service which you require, similarly clothes. Now, let's place a third dependency in the picture, which is a laptop. Now, just imagine a situation where you have a laptop, you got it from the office, you came back home, you worked, and then you are going back to work the next day, but you're unable to find your laptop. So where will you actually look in the first place? Your backpack, then your room, then the entire house. Just notice the pattern. The search area is basically increasing. First your backpack, then your room, and then your entire house. And if you are still unable to find your laptop, then you're fired. No kidding. So just place this picture when I try to explain the next thing. Before that, I want you to understand one word, injector. What is an injector? Injector is basically responsible for instantiating the dependency and injecting it to the component or service. In other words, it is your go-to guy for anything you need for the component to run. Angular has two injector hierarchies. One is the element, one is the module. The element injector is injected at the component or the directive level, and the module has various levels. So when I talk about the module injector hierarchy, the first one which comes is the root injector, then is the platform injector, and then finally the null injector. So how this works? So before I explained the scenario where you're trying to find your laptop and broadening your search area, similarly, Angular works the same way. When you are asking for a dependency, Angular tries to look for that dependency in its own injector. If it is not able to find in that, it goes up to the level till the null injector. Let's understand with the help of this service. This is a service which we painted earlier, car service, and it's provided in root, which means it is available at the root module. And this is my user component, which is injecting that service. This component will have an element injector attached to it, which is going to get that service instance for you. So first, it will look into its injector, then the root injector. In our scenarios, we have declared car service with provided in root. That means this is available at the root injector. So what will happen at this level? It will give us back the instance and you're free to use the service. Let's assume a scenario in the beginning when we were getting that error. We forgot to add that provided in root. Then it's fine. It looks for the service in the root injector. It does not find that, and it goes up till the level of null injector, and finally it gives you the error. So this is basically resolving the dependencies. These can be modified with the following decorators like optional, self, skip self, and host. So these four things are basically modifying this default behavior of resolving the dependencies. I can give you a quick example for the first one, like optional. If you go back to the scenario where we discussed that you have to go to work, for some people, having breakfast before going to work is good, but for some people, they have the breakfast after reaching the office. So it's not an optional thing. It's an optional thing. So this is how you can paint these analogies to actually map to the decorators. Thank you. I hope you were able to understand that basically what the Angular does in resolving the dependencies and how dependency injection actually works. I will talk more about these decorators, but I think that is better for the next session.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. That's a really great analogy, and I think it's a really cool way to think about how to debug going around, figuring out that error, because sometimes, you're not sure, like, where is the service coming from? So understanding how Angular does it helps you figure out
exactly. When I was
bugs.
preparing this talk, I was one thing I had in mind. I want to explain to people how I understood.
Mm-hmm. It's awesome. Yeah, thank you so much.
That was your first ever talk?
Yes. Did you not notice the bloopers?
No.
Nope, not at all.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, so before we get into the Q&A for your talk, we try to do this now where we're getting to know our speakers a little better outside of your, just talking about dependency injection. So we had a few questions for you. One was that recently I saw on Twitter, I think it might be your cover picture. It's like, it shows you like on like a mountain or something, and there's like, looks like a temple in the background. Is that in
Yes.
India?
Yes, it's actually Sikkim. It's a beautiful state, and this is one of the highest temples, and it's just looks amazing, and it's more amazing when it's covered with snow.
Oh, I
So I
bet.
went twice over there, one with snow and one without snow. I definitely like the snow one better, but yeah, the ambience is amazing. I mean, I just don't have words to explain the feeling when you're at the top and there's just breeze and everything. It's nice. It's amazing.
Yeah. So do you enjoy like hiking and the outdoors and all that?
Not hiking, but yeah, I do like to travel.
Okay, awesome. And for more in your professional history, what is your proudest career achievement up to this point?
This one.
This one, really? Well, you did an awesome job on the talk, so.
Thank you.
And so our last question is, do you have any professional heroes or programming heroes, and what do you admire about them?
Heroes as in, yes, I did had guru or mentor during my first couple of years, and he really helped me in order to understand how to actually solve problems. Learning programming is easy, but you are actually using it to the best to solve problems is something which is amazing.
Great. Jason, do we have any community questions?
First of all, the community is just going crazy. They loved your talk. Good job.
Thank you.
But the one question we do have is, where would you put these alternate decorators that you mentioned, the optional self?
Yes, so they would go beside when you are injecting the dependencies. So as of now, you're doing private something something. So if you wanted to have an optional decorator, you need to provide it there itself. So Angular knows that I'm not supposed to search, I'm not supposed to throw an error for an optional dependency.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Do we have any other questions, or just kind of scanning chat real quick? Okay. Let me go back to the slideshow real quick.
No.
All right, change slide. There we go. Next, we have Jeffrey Hauser. Jeffrey works for Disney Plus streaming service, and you're a technical entrepreneur, and you do a lot of writing. And is that correct? You do a lot of like, you have a blog post. You also have a lot of like ebooks and books available on like Kindle, I think I saw.
Yep, that's correct.
That's very cool. Yeah, stop this real quick. So before we get into your talk, we did a few questions for you just to get to know you better. You also say on your website that you're a musician. What kind of music do you play, and what instruments?
Well, you could probably see a guitar behind me, but I can play a bunch of things. So I saxophone lessons when I was super younger. I've taken piano lessons. I've taken voice lessons. I own a drum set. I've played bass and guitar in a lot of bands, and I've touched on a bunch of different instruments along the way.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, so you just can handle anything, right?
Yeah, some easier than others.
So I played the saxophone a little bit when I was younger. What sax did you pick up?
So I had an alto, but I actually like the baritone sax better.
Oh, wow. Nice.
I also saw on your website that you're into like old school style adventure games.
Yep.
What's your favorite?
So actually, also behind me, the pictures are of King's Quest 1. Well, actually, 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 4, and 5 are behind me, and then 3 is on this wall. So yeah, so old school point and click adventure games, sort of like that, is what I often gravitate to. So I love the old Sierra games. I've played a ton, both past and modern, for that genre. I used to write reviews for justadventure.com, and there's whatever, I don't know, 50 or so articles I've written for them during my heyday.
So is that kind of like that game Myst, where it's kind of point and click, but you're like solving problems or solving puzzles? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So
very cool.
So less fast games like first person shooters, and more like explore and think and stuff like that.
Maniac Mansion.
Yep. Exactly
Very
that
cool.
type of game.
And then I also noticed on your site that you talk a bit about Cold Fusion. It looks like your website is in Cold Fusion, which I think it's really cool to see, like that very old school style HTML website. Do you still do, other than your website, do you still do a lot of coding in Cold Fusion?
Not so much anymore. One of my books is integrating Angular with Cold Fusion. Is actually one of my more popular ones, surprisingly, in terms of sales. But yeah, no, I don't do a lot of Cold Fusion professional development anymore. Occasionally, it would crop up for clients. Would find me as a Cold Fusion expert, but not so much anymore.
Okay. Would you recommend any developers pick it up these days, or?
I would look, like, if you want to pick it up for fun, I think it's a cool language. It'll support modern applications. If you want to do it to actually get a job, I would make sure, check the job postings in your area before trying to learn it.
Right. Okay. Great. All right. I guess we'll let you get started with your talk now.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
No problem. I am going to share my screen, which everybody should see now. Let's go like this. So, hello everybody. This is going to be about optimizing Angular components for reuse. And I'm going to focus particularly on sort of APIs and how we can sort of morph the API when we want to build an Angular component for reuse, as opposed to sort of a one-time component for our applications. So these would be the things that you might put in a library that you want to share across multiple projects. Before that, we already heard a little about me. But here's a little more that might be relevant to this. I've done, basically, I was a consultant, small business owner for a very, very, very long time. I did a lot with Cold Fusion. I did a lot with Flex. If anybody remembers that, I actually had a business, Flextras, building UI components for Flex developers. And working with the Flex framework and sort of having that business and working with hundreds of customers using my sort of commercial library, sort of helped form an opinion on how we can sort of optimize an API for reuse. And we're going to go over some of those learnings today. Present, I'm an engineering manager at Disney Streaming, but I came through the tech track, so my skills haven't atrophied yet. I blog weekly at jeffryhauser.com, and I write the book series, which is about integrating Angular with a lot of other technologies. So that's me. That's what gives me the right to sort of be up here preaching to everybody. And we're going to start today with a simple component. It's going to accept an array of something, and we're going to loop over it, and we're going to display objects. We're going to iterate over that component and expand the API to basically expand and make it more reusable. And then at the end, we'll have a bunch of different examples of this. So first, I want to take a very simple component. We're going to have an input, which I'm going to call a data provider, which is an array of something, an array of objects in our first example. And the functionality, we're just going to loop over those items in the array and display them. And it's going to look something like this. Let's go to code, because IntelliJ is more interesting. So this data provider we're looking at is an array of objects. Each object has a single property called name, and I just made up a bunch of nonsense names to flesh it out. So our component has just a standard component. I generated it with ng, the Angular CLI, and the input is a data provider, which is any, and it's an array of whatevers. And then inside our HTML template, I'm just looping over the data provider and displaying the name property. And I have it up and running in the background, so we can see it. It's displaying a list of names. Generally, all our examples are going to have a very similar display. The display is the least boring part of this, and the API is more interesting. This is how we actually use it. We have app sample one, which is sort of the name of the component, sample one, and we're passing the object data provider in as a data provider. So that is sort of where we start and where we're starting with this. These slides, just what we went over by looking at code. So what's good about this? So we took display logic, and most of you in your own development have probably built something like this, where you had to send an array into a component and display it. So it's good that we encapsulated this display logic into its own component, but it's, in terms of long-term reuse, this is imperfect. First, the data provider uses a generic type, which is ideally, if we could avoid that, I would love to avoid that. It's actually not something we're going to solve today, but we could solve it by creating an interface or something. So instead of using any, it could be an interface. In this case, the data provider must be an array of objects. It won't support simple strings. It won't support an array of arrays. So there's not a lot of flexibility in terms of the data types. And especially when we're doing development in like a microservices system, and we may not own the data we're getting back or the system that returns data to us, we may not have control over those objects that, that we want. So we may want our component to morph to the data sources that we're getting, as opposed to the other way around. And then with our current implementation, the data provider objects must contain a name field, which works fine for the data provider we have. But if we had a different data provider, that may not work with a different object with different properties. So we're going to try and morph this component. We're going to actually address the last item first, and we're going to change the component so that we're not explicitly looking for a name field. So we're going to add a new input property on our component, which is called label field. It's going to allow the component to dynamically introspect the data provider to determine what we're going to display. And instead of showing you the slides, I'm going to go back to code. We're still going to use the same object data provider that we had last time. And bump that up and bump that up. Yeah, so we're going to add a brand new input called label field. And I defaulted the value to label instead of name in this case, just so I could show you how it changes when we actually use it. And inside our HTML template, instead of sort of data.name that we had before, we're just using the label field input to the component to do data label field. And this sort of allows our component to be more flexible. When we go over to, I'm going to copy this one or undo sample two. So now with sample two, we're passing in the same exact data provider we were for sample one. We're just adding a label field, and we're passing a hard-coded string in as name. So that should recompile. And if I go back to the browser, we have sample two. The exact same display. Like I said, the display is the least interesting part of this. But what we do have is we have a more flexible API in the component that we're developing. Seen all this, so it's good that we've took one step to making our component sort of morph to the data provider instead of having the data providers morph to our components. And we no longer require our data source to have a name field, so that's positive. So there's a few sort of continued problems with this approach. So the display string still must be represented by a single property in an array. What if we're getting an array of objects with like a first name or a last name field? we won't be able to display both of them with our current APIs using this label field component. And we're still limited to an array of objects. We can't change that with what we've currently added to this display. So what are we going to do next? We're going to add something I call a label function, which is basically a callback function that we can pass into our component that the consumers of our component will know how to basically introspect their own data provider so our component doesn't have to. And I'll show you some examples of this as we go on. We're also going to add basically an internal method to our component called item2displayLabel, which is going to determine the logic of, are we going to use a label function or a label field, or are we just going to display the component as is? So let's take a look at this in code. I'm going to close out sample 2 and open up sample 3. So first, add a brand new input label function. And we don't see this often, or I don't see this often anyway, but the type I'm defining here is actually an arrow function. That's how we define an arrow function as a type. And I'm adding an exclamation here, which if you're using, I think this was added in Angular 12 or something, at least in terms of probably a TypeScript thing. This just means it's okay for this value to not be defaulted and to not have a value. So now we can pass in a function into this component, and that can be used. I'm going to go actually to HTML. So the HTML, I changed instead of data.label field, I'm replacing it with sort of calling this item to display label, and I'm passing in the data. So back here, we have some logic back in the component class. So type of item. So we're introspecting the item. Is it an object? If it is, we may want to apply the label function to it if it exists. So I'm giving an order precedence that the label function is more important than the label field. If there's no label function, if there is a label function, we call it and pass in an item. If there's a label field, we use that. Otherwise, we're just returning the item as is. So basically, we have an order of operations if the item is an object. If it's not an object, if it's a string or an integer, we're just returning it as is for display. So this sort of function, this logic, which is internal or intended to be internal to our sort of sample 3 component, is just a way to figure it out. How is this used? So actually, close this one. Actually, yeah, let's keep with this one for a moment. And I'm gonna uncomment sample 3 and object data provider, same one, and I'm gonna a label function, which is just returning item.name. The label functions will get more interesting. I have a more complicated example a bit later. So everything recompiled, sample 3. So once again, the display is exactly the same, but we've created a much more flexible approach. Actually, let's skip slides because code is always more fun. So I'm going to close this one, and I have a simple data provider here. This is just an array of strings. And our component, our third sample, will just handle this magically. So we just pass in the simple data provider. It's going to go in the HTML template. It's going to loop over this, call item to display data. It's going to see it's not an object. It's just going to return the item as it is. And boom, just strings. And so with no changes to our component API or nothing special, it's just automatically knowing how to handle a different sort of data providers. And I have one more example in here, which this actually comes from from something you actually had to deal with. Whereas, something I've actually dealt with in the real world doing app development. And we actually have an array of arrays here, and each array has an object, basically a name and a purpose is what I called it. So like, it could be a primary name, it could be a nickname, it could be a maiden name, it could be some other type of name. We could have like first name or last name properties. So how does our component handle this? We're going to have to write our own custom function. And I think eventually, when we get down to the bottom, I added one with a nickname, but not a primary. And I added one with others just to have something different. So how do we handle this? Basically, what we needed to implement in the real world was basically fallback logic. We're going to display the primary, but if that doesn't exist, we're going to display nickname. And if that doesn't exist, we'll display the maiden name. And if that doesn't exist, we'll do a sort of a no name found. So, and I'm just doing array searches here, potentially inefficient if this doesn't find the primary, but because you're doing a lot of searches. So it kind of, from that perspective, it's imperfect, but this way your component can handle it if you have to deal with these data structures that are coming from other systems where you cannot easily change them. And I'll uncomment out the last sample. And as we see here, like the display is almost identical. We just have different data providers and a different way to get the to get at the data. So at XYZ and no name found, which means there's no fallback. And XYZ was sort of a nickname fallback. And otherwise, most of them, I think, were full name. So yeah, let's go back to slides now, since I'm out of code samples. So yeah, we spoke about the label function, item to display label, about this. And this sort of approach really gives us just very flexible APIs. And it's really about thinking of how can I make my component API conform to data structures or inputs so that the consumer of this component can control things. And stuff like this can expand a lot. You can take these concepts and apply them to different, for example, we had like a specialized select box in one case. And we were able to build our APIs to basically expose selected items, and like the items we were getting were different from our data provider source. Like we had objects in the data provider source, but we only knew what was selected based on a string. So we had to provide APIs to convert from one to the other, from like a selected item to a data provider object or vice versa. And we provided APIs for that sort of thing. So, but it's still using the same concept of providing basically functions, APIs to let your consumer modify the component so that the component is as flexible as possible and can be used by anybody. So anyway, quick review of everything I went out today. We started with a simple sample, which is just displaying an array of objects. And with this first simple sample, it was very hard-coded to a name property. Then we opened up, added a label field input so that our component could morph to any property. Then we added a label function and an item to display label, which allows us even more extensibility within our component. And we showed a few examples of handling that with an array of strings or an array of arrays. Like I said, not every component you ever build needs to be optimized for reuse, and it does take more work to get there. So just something to think about as you're building out your components and as you're building out the apps. So already mentioned this, plenty of hiring, including 2 teams that use Angular. So feel free to reach out to me. If anybody wants to grab my books or screencasts, learnwith.com. Like I said, there are books and there are screencast series. So use NG Community Meetup as a discount code for 20% off. And in my GitHub, I will get this presentation up there sometime this week. And thank you. I'm going to stop screen sharing, and I think we're going to open up the floor for questions.
That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm always on the lookout for new ways to expand my components and make them more reusable. Thank you.
Yeah, like I really like the approach, especially if you're doing libraries or something like that. But for just like a single use component within an app, often it's not worth the overhead.
Very, very cool.
So there is always a balance to be made.
I guess questions. The very first question was, why do you like the baritone sax over the alto sax?
It has a really deeper sound, so that's I just gravitated towards it more. But
It's also
I never
a cooler looking instrument.
Yeah, a bigger instrument if ever serves me. So yeah, just.
And then Bastian asked, when using a function to retrieve a label, what would be the execution context? I'm guessing this would be the component where the function is defined, but I'm not entirely sure.
Oh, that would depend. So if you use a regular function, it would be the component would be the execution context. If you use an arrow function, then the consumer would be the execution context. So you can go either way. I would actually like to make the assumption that you don't have control over that, but technically somebody could get into the internals by using a normal function. So, which ideally you want to discourage. So I would usually push people to use an arrow function so they have control over the execution context. And then when you're using a callback like that, whether it's a label function or something, try to pass in as much data as you think they'll need.
I totally agree with that. I think you should avoid this as much as possible in modern JavaScript. There's just too many pitfalls.
Yeah.
And the next question, when you're using the function in the template, isn't it going to be called in every cycle or not if you're using on push, I guess? That's from Susana Algasol.
That is definitely a concern. So yes, I believe that's the case. Now, I've never run into performance problems with that, but it depends what you're doing in the function. And so it's definitely a concern and something you want to watch out for.
Okay, that's a good point. John Z asks, how about passing a template ref to the component?
I'm not opposed to it. It's not something I've ever tried or experimented with.
Sounds good. Those are all the questions from the chat.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jeffrey.
Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, let's see. Can I ever find the share screen button? All right, next we have Colum Ferry from Ireland. Colum is a senior engineer at Nrwl working on the Angular plugin for NX. So if you're not using NX, you should, right? Colum's interested in achieving micro frontends, and we're going to learn about that versus module federation, which I'm really looking forward to because I have no idea what that is. You also have a couple of kids and are interested in Formula One. How old are your children?
One's 5 and one's 4.
5 and 4. Wow. So you got your hands full.
Yeah.
Do you watch the Formula E at all?
I've seen one race when I was waiting on a different one. This is like a replay.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I haven't seen it, but I've heard it's strange because there's like no sound, like because the cars are so quiet versus.
Yeah, there's different dynamic to it. Even like how it runs, like you have to have so much power left in the battery and things like that before you cross the line. I know like Formula One is like similar kind of rule regarding like the amount of fuel you have, but yeah, it's slightly strange when you're watching it.
Have you ever been to a race in person?
No, it's one of my goals, hopefully. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd love to go see one.
Okay. I saw you recently tweeted about Webstorm and the refactoring tools, and we are kind of talking about that earlier. I believe there was somebody in chat that was asking, like, what is the advantages of Webstorm over VS Code, and And has WebStorm won you over, or are you a
Yeah, it
VS
really
Code user?
has. No, it's really won me over. But I was using VS Code since like, I don't know, 5 years, 6 years maybe. I've been using VS Code a long time now. And I always had this idea in my head that you don't need WebStorm, you don't need JetBrains IDEs, that VS Code is good enough, until about 3 weeks ago when it just wasn't good enough. It got to the stage where TS server kept crashing on me. It wasn't finding things fast enough when I was trying to do like find implementations or find references and things. Then if I tried to save a file, it would take way too long to even try to save a file, because it was running through all the extensions to see if the extensions had anything they had to do. And it got to the stage where it was slowing me down quite a bit. So I was like, okay, I need to switch. I need a different IDE at this stage. So I tried out the trial of WebStorm and immediately was just blown away of how fast it was after the initial indexing, but it was super fast afterwards. The refactoring tools, it was just, even the keyboard navigation, that was one of the big things too. Just being able to jump about everywhere just using the keyboard was so much. It's so good. It's definitely converted me.
Yeah, it's awesome. I was using Writer for .NET with VS Code for Angular, and I was like, I'm getting used to all the keyboard, the bindings and everything. Like, I'll try WebStorm for Angular, and it's been wonderful. I've really enjoyed it. So you're from Derry. What do you like about living in Derry, and what makes you proud to be Irish?
Derry's great. It's kind of out of the way. It's not like a major city or anything, so it's kind of quaint, would be the best way to put it. But I grew up here. All my family's around me, and I like it. It's one of those things. It's like, it's comfort at this stage. Like, you know everything. You know your way about. It's not too big of a city. You can get everywhere pretty easily. 10 minutes takes you from one side of it to the other. So yeah.
Okay. And last question here before you get started. What's been your experience working for a team that's largely based in another time zone? I imagine most of your team is over here in the United States, and you're way ahead over there in Ireland.
Nrwl handles quite well. We're actually a pretty diverse team. We've got like a developer in, I think it's either Abu Dhabi or Dubai. We've got one in Greece, in Austria, Italy, Ireland, Scotland. Then we've got ones in Canada and America. So they're a pretty diverse team. So we've sort of perfected the idea of asynchronous working. So we made a message in Slack, but we don't look for an immediate response. Whenever somebody gets time, they'll respond it. And then any meetings that we do need to have, we'll just try and find a time that works in everybody's calendar with the overlap in terms of like meetings. So it takes a bit of getting used to, but it's very easy to get used to once you do get used to it. Okay.
Yeah, because my team, we're all about 1 to 2 hours apart, so it's not a big difference. So I can imagine it being a little tricky to get used to a larger time zone difference.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll let you get started on your talk. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so we talk about module federation and micro frontends. So these are two terms that we have seen quite a lot recently, and everybody seems to be talking about them in some sense. If it's not in the Angular world, if it's in the React world, just everybody, this is the new terms. And as was said, I'm Colum Ferry. I'm a senior engineer at Nrwl, and I work on the NX work for the NX core team, and I work on the Angular plugin of NX, and I help design our module federation support. So this talk's going to be about module federation, what it is, micro frontends, and what it is, and then when you actually need one over the other, because everybody seems to just jump straight to micro frontends when you might not actually need micro frontends. So with that, we'll start with what they are. So a micro frontend tends to be an overall application that we would call a host application, which is composed of multiple features or multiple remote applications. And these smaller applications tend to be fully autonomous to the overall application, and they're worked on by feature teams, and they're deployed independently, and then the host application will just fetch that at runtime. Whereas module federation seems to be at the stage now where everybody thinks it's synonymous, where module federation is micro frontends, but module federation is really just a technology that allows us to separate our build into either local modules or remote modules. So local modules are modules that are available build time, and they get compiled in the final bundle. If we inspect the final bundle, we can see that they're there, whereas remote modules aren't available at build time. It's something that we're telling Webpack at build time, okay, this module will exist at runtime. It doesn't right now, but it will exist. And then it gets loaded. That module will get loaded at runtime asynchronously. So Webpack will compile in such a way that it won't fetch that remote module at runtime, and it won't fail a build, even though it's not there at build time. So you can see how this can lend itself to micro frontends, such that micro frontends are independently deployed, and they live in a remote location, and the host application doesn't know where they are at that time, but it can find them. So this is why everybody thinks that module federation is very similar to micro frontends, because we can use module federation to achieve micro frontends, but there is a slight difference. One is a technology and one is just like an architectural pattern. So the question comes right now is, what should we use? So I'm going to create a story here, an imagination, using our imagination to think of a scenario, which is an organization called Fubar. They've got their startup, they've got a small application, but over time, that application grows, becomes quite large. And as applications grow, the time to serve the application, for one, goes up. And that will mean that developers are spending less time actually able to be productive to develop code or develop the application, because if they're waiting for 5-10 minutes for a rebuild to happen when they serve an application or make a change, then their productivity is just naturally going to decrease. And this happens because the build takes longer. And when the build takes longer, our CI build times are going to increase. So our time to feedback from CI increases. So it takes longer for us to actually even get that feedback. But it also means that our operational costs are increasing, because now CI is taking longer. We're spending more minutes completing the CI, and that correlates to increased costs. The thing then to consider as well is that when our developers are spending less time actually writing code and being productive, combined with increased operational costs, then we're spending even more money but shipping less code in a longer period of time. Normally, applications, when they get to a certain extent, are split into features. To an extent, it will use domain-driven design, but most people probably won't realize that at the start until they start realizing that these features are independent and they make up a larger piece of the application. At the start, there's a handful of developers in the organization that are working between these features. They're moving between them all. But as the application scales, then each of these features start to become independent pieces of the application, and we create feature teams they work solely on each of these features. And at this stage, the isolation increases between feature teams. So they don't care. Feature team A doesn't care so much about feature team B or feature B or feature C, because all it needs is its own feature. They need to work in their own area of the application, and it starts to get to a stage where they feel more isolated, and they want a bit more independence. But because everything is growing, everything's scaling up, and the application is scaling up, these features are scaling up, the build times are increasing. And it gets to the stage where feature team A needs to work on their portion, but they need to build feature B and feature C just to get the app served so that they can work on feature A. So it starts to become a problem then where they feel like they only need feature A to be built and to be served. So feature team will come on with some concerns. Serve takes forever. They're waiting 10 minutes for an app to serve. They only need to worry about their own part. And CI is taking way too long on PRs. They can't get anything merged fast because they're waiting for 20-30 minutes for CI to finish. They get feedback if anything does fail. It's taking longer for that feedback to come back in for them to fix it. So people start to think, okay, micro frontends is the solution. This is what we're going to do. We're going to go for micro frontends because it offers us an ability to serve and build only our portion of the application, our feature. We can just isolate this now into our app, and we can just serve and build this. So the build time does get reduced, the serve times get reduced, and because you're only building and serving your part of the application, and developer productivity increases, problem solved. But is it? So a lot of complexity that comes with micro frontends, and that becomes more apparent in the sense that a micro frontend has to be deployed independently from its host application. And then at that stage, you can start having version mismatches and complexity over managing these versions. you can have difficulties in the integration points of feature A and feature B. If feature B hasn't released at the same time as feature A, and feature A has changed the contract that communicates between feature A and feature B, then if there's no version control, no way of managing what versions can communicate with each other on the host level, then it could get this stage where it just breaks at runtime because there's no control there. The change that was made was a break and change between the two front ends, but we don't see that statically at build time anymore. So we get that inconsistency in integration points, and then shared code becomes more difficult to manage for the same reason, where feature team A changes something, the shared code, and it gets redeployed and it lives in the host application and feature A, but feature B also needs to use the shared code, but it's using it needs either an older version, or if there is no version management, it's getting the same new version as feature A built, but feature B wasn't expecting the new version and it has some break-in changes, then that affects feature B and they can't build. They run into issues where they may need to release sooner than expected when they're trying to control their own release schedule. Because of this, then we start to see code duplication. Feature team A has seen, okay, that has caused a problem. Let's just copy the shared component, shared library into our feature and the R slice of the application, and we'll manage it there. Any divergences we'll need, we'll do it here. And then similar, feature team B, feature team C might do the same. They might just bring that shared code. Suddenly there's a lot of duplication across the whole code base. And one other thing that seems to happen is that when we start isolating teams out into feature teams that are focusing mainly on a front end, they start to get this idea that their app isn't part of a larger application. It's not part of a full setup anymore. It's just their app, and their app is getting deployed and make sure it works fine. So you get into the idea of, okay, well, I want to use React instead of Angular now because we can solve this with React easier than we could with Angular. We're isolated from the rest of the organization in its release and its tech stack, so we can use this different tech stack. But then that becomes an issue when we do have people moving across teams, or when we do integrate everything back together again. So it causes a lot of friction, a lot of issues with micro frontends. But if we go back to what problems we actually needed to solve at this time, it was just to reduce the build time in CI, reduce the serve time so the developers could work faster. And we only wanted to serve the portion of the app that the feature team needs. And Module Federation can offer us all this without needing to introduce any complexity around the actual managing of versions, managing independent deployments, and all the other complexities that come along with micro frontends. So Module Federation, it lets us split the app into multiple buildable verticals, similar to micro frontends. It lets us compose the smaller build artifacts into the final application. And at development, we can build just that one portion and run that portion that we need for the feature team. One of the big benefits is that because we're using Module Federation and we're not going the full extent to micro frontends, we can still deploy the single app. Instead of deploying everything, we can just deploy one single application, but still get the benefit of increased build times and increased serve times, reduced build times and reduced serve times, and only needing to build and run the portion of the feature of the application that we need. There are still some cons to be aware of when we do this, and that would be around like tree shaking isn't as powerful. When it comes to Module Federation, we need to specify what third-party packages, what dependencies can be shared between each slice. And at that stage, Webpack can't be as deterministic about what is used in each part of the application, each slice of the application. So it will include the full RxJS library, for example. If you're using it, it will include that full library, but it will create it in its own chunk. So it'll only get loaded when it's required, which means that any other feature or lazy loaded module uses RxJS. It doesn't need to then bring its own bundle of RxJS. It'll use the bundle that was loaded, but it's just to be aware that that bundle is going to be there. And then feature teams can't deploy independently of each other. This is where you would probably make the biggest decision between Module Federation and micro frontends. If you don't need to deploy independently of the other teams, then Module Federation is the way to go. If you do need that control over when you release your applications, release each portion of the application, each feature team needs that control, then micro frontends might be the solution. And it's just something to consider more deeply because of all the extra complexities that come along with that. That said, you could use module federation and just use feature flags. If you're trying to control release scheduling, you can use a feature flag implementation to control when certain features from different teams are actually released. There is a caveat, and it is that we can only get the CI build benefits if we use a remote caching system that supports distributed cache, such as NX Cloud, sorry. So this is because we need the cache of all the other slices of the application to be available at build time. So if feature team B has built their application through CI, CI will have a copy of that cache. When I go to serve the application, then I'll just use feature team B's cache. I'm not going to worry about having to rebuild it locally. I'll just use the cache that feature team B had created. Similar in CI, when it comes to actually building the application, feature team A, B, and C have all created their changes. They've all got local cache that has their feature cached. Then a CI will just say, okay, they've got these builds cached. I'll just use the cache, and then it'll use the cache, massively reducing the time it takes to build the application. So NX offers this a great DX with module federation because it caches the other team slices, and then we can use that to serve the full application with only your slice of the application being served. So that means you're using the other team's cache for their side of the application to be able to launch the full application, but only have your slice of the application be live reloaded and have the hot module replacement and everything like that for just your slice, because we'll statically serve the other slices of the application using the cache from other teams. So I'm going to show quickly how we can at least speed up build times using this technique. So I have an application here, which has a bunch of libraries. And if I show quickly just how many projects there's I think around, don't quote me, I think it's like 20 odd, or not 20, sorry, 50 odd projects, close to that. And each of these projects have their own 50 components. So there's a lot of components here. It's all just what we've standardly generated with the Angular component schematic. So there's not much code actually happening within them. It's just whatever the boilerplate that gets generated. So, but when we run NX build, and this will just use a standard Angular builder, we'll see that this will take, it used cache for it, but we can see that before it took about, what's that, 81, sorry, I'll just delete the cache, be easier. So now this is running. This is using the standard Angular builder to build the full application with all the libraries, no vertical slices, just the full application as it stands, all hooked together. And then the next step, we will split the application into 2 slices, and we will build it once to show the impact of having to build everything, like the worst case scenario where you do have to rebuild everything. And then we will make a change to 1 slice of the application, and we'll see how that impacts the build time. This should only take about 2 minutes, I think. Last time I tested, it only took about 2 minutes. But even with that, we can see that this is slow. This is slowing people down. If it gets any bigger, if it takes 5-10 minutes, this is a massive impact to developers. Okay. We should get some stats now on how long this took. 2 minutes. Yeah, 100,000 milliseconds. So what we want to try to do now is we want to split this into 2 vertical slices that uses module federation to show that this will increase or decrease how long it takes to build. So NX has some generators to help with this. So if we just create a host application, with two remotes. These will be our two vertical slices of the application. One remote 2. We will then hook these libraries. If we take a look, quickly at the libraries, we can see we do have this set out in the structure where we have a set of libraries under app 0 and a set of libraries under app 1. So these can be our two vertical slices of the application. And these are our entry points. So we grab the libraries for app 0. So I wait for Webstorm to catch up. And I drop this one in the app 1. And then we'll do the same, except using the second slice of the application for remote 2. Okay, so these two applications, these two vertical slices are now set up to slice this whole repository, this code base into two. These two remotes deal with their own section, their own vertical slice, and the host application simply just combines these together and do one application. At the moment, it's just using a remote module or an import, dynamic import using written, but it'll still be used just to build this. So we'll still get the same result in terms of building. So we build the host. This is a worst case scenario. So it will build everything. It'll build the two slices and then it'll build itself, the host application, which will be our main application that would get published and deployed and be seen by the customers. Oh, I didn't, sorry. It's my bad. I forgot to add the implicit dependencies. Try that again. So now we can see NX is going to build the two other applications, remote 1 and remote 2, and then it will try build the host again. Again, this is worst case scenario because we have to rebuild everything. So it will take just as long, maybe a slightly longer than the Angular app build. But from then on, we start getting the benefit of the caches from other slices, from other teams. We only rebuild the slice that needs to be rebuilt when we make a change. And from that, we get the reduced CI and reduced build times, the improved developer experience, because we then start with the distribution from NX Cloud, we could get the cache from other teams where it'll be very unlikely that we ever have to rebuild everything. So overall, that took about 1 minute. So already we can see because some of these are happening in parallel, we're getting some benefit. But now we can see the biggest benefit would be if we make a change to just one slice of the application. So if we just throw a console log in here just to indicate that there has been a change to this slice, when we do a rebuild of host, we immediately get one of the slices read from cache because it never changed. NX knows it doesn't change. We'll just read the cache for that. Now we're rebuilding just one slice and then the overall application. It took about 45 seconds. So we were just the build time from Angular from 2 minutes, potentially over 2 minutes, to 45 seconds using module federation. And we don't add the complexities of all the micro frontend scenarios into this. It's just straight module federation. So if you have any questions, you can ask the QA, or if you want to afterwards, you can reach out to me on Twitter. I guess we're going over the QA panel now.
We are. That was awesome. Really amazing. I really need to look into the NX Cloud more. Every time I see it, I'm like, I need to look into that. We have 2 questions. The first one is from Ankush. And he says, what do you mean by local modules and how you will build them separately using the module federation?
Okay, so yeah, local modules is just anything that Webpack conceives as a module that is available build time. So an exported function could technically be a module. The way Webpack will interpret that is that it will create a module.exports, which will contain the function name and the object that gets exported. Webpack will see that as a module, and then a local one means that it will be available at build time. It can see it, it can inspect it, it can then include it in the bundle. Whereas a remote module is one that is not available at build time, and it's just that it'll pull it, it'll fetch it using some kind of fetching mechanism. You can control that yourself, or you can just use Webpack's module federation's built-in version of that, where it will fetch it across the wire from a remote location.
Awesome. Yeah, I really need to look into this stuff. When you tweeted earlier this week, as far as I was concerned before your tweet, module federation and MFEs were the same thing. So I really appreciate this talk. It was amazing. The next question is from, I'm probably butchering his name, Shaul 9. And they ask, can someone tell me if I'm using some kind of third-party library in an MFE, should I add it to the shell package JSON also? An Angular module federation, for example, material?
It depends. If you're using module federation with NX, we have helpers in place that will analyze your project using the project graph, and it will see what dependencies you have, and we'll share it automatically. So you don't even have to worry about that at that stage. If you're using module federation in like an Angular CLI using potentially Manfred's share helpers, you will need to set up what libraries you need to share. So you need to be more cognizant of what packages need to be shared between the host and the remote applications.
Awesome. And honestly, I love NX because just like you said, if you're using NX, most of the stuff's done for you. And that's a huge win. It takes so much of my time researching and setting things up. So thank you. That was a great presentation.
No problem.
Looks like we had a couple other questions come in, or I guess one from Blair Learman. They asked, will the new Angular standalone components still be usable with module federation? Is the module team specific to NG modules or just a term for a group of objects?
Yeah, actually with standalone components, module federation will actually probably become even easier to use and implement because you'll be able to federate just a component, and then we can use just the dynamic import to load that onto like a a template. So it will become actually easier to use module federation and create micro frontends with standalone components. It actually will make like some of these scenarios where you're trying to slice the build up into even smaller chunks even better. The term module is literally just what gets exported, well, your exports basically, what's set up as a JavaScript module.
Sounds great. I was concerned we'd lost Chris, but
nope, I'm still here. Yes, I don't think we have any other questions. I wanted to thank the three of you for coming out and giving these talks and taking time out of your day to put these together and give such great talks today. So thank you very much.